There is a kind of morning that stops surprising you. You learn the sound of the generator the way you learn a person's cough, and you know from the first stutter whether it will hold through the afternoon or die at the worst possible moment, which is always during a fitting. You learn the smell of wet plaster and the particular silence of a waiting room full of people who have already waited years. You stop expecting the day to be anything other than the day. You arrive, you work, you send people home a little more whole than they came, and then you do it again. That was supposed to be my Thursday. I'm going to tell you what actually happened that day instead. My name is Ini Circumflex Quembo. I'm a prosthetist at a rehabilitation clinic in Wambo in the Central Highlands of Angola. I make legs mostly, some arms. I take the measure of what a person has left and I build them something to stand on. It's a strange thing to say out loud at a dinner party, which is partly why I don't go to many. But the work itself matters to me more than I can explain without sounding like a brochure, so I'll just say this. I was born in this town. I left it to be trained properly, and then I came back on purpose, which is the part people never understand. They always ask why anyone would leave Lisbon to come here. I usually say something about family. The real answer takes longer. When I was 9, my cousin Bruno was 11. There was a footpath behind the old church that everyone used to reach the water, because the other road took 2 hours on foot and this one took 20 minutes. Everyone knew the path was dangerous. The whole town knew. There had been a war here for a very long time, and the war had left things in the ground that did not know the war was over. People used the path anyway, because you cannot tell a mother carrying a baby and an empty jerry can that she must walk 2 hours each way in the heat when the short path is right there, and most days nothing happens. Most days nothing happens. That is the trick of it. That is how the ground waits. One morning something happened. I was not there. I only heard the sound far off, flat, like a door slamming in an empty house. Bruno did not come home. I have spent a great deal of my life since then thinking about footpaths and about the difference between a safe road and a short one, and about how much a person will risk just to carry water. That is why I fit limbs instead of staying somewhere comfortable, not because it undoes anything. It doesn't. But because the buried thing took something from people, and I am stubborn enough to want to give a little of it back. So that is who was standing in the clinic that Thursday morning, resenting the day before it had even begun. Because I had been told a visitor was coming, and I had quietly decided to hate it. Let me describe the place, so you understand what a visitor means. The clinic is a low building of pale concrete with a tin roof that turns the afternoons into an oven. There is a main workshop where we cast and fit, a row of treatment rooms, a corridor that floods when the rain is serious, and a waiting area with plastic chairs bolted in a line against the wall. We are 7 most days. There is Teresa, who runs the front desk and the entire clinic and probably the town, if anyone checked. There is old Faustino, who has been casting plaster longer than I have been alive and whose hands are steadier than any machine I trained on in Europe. There is Bernardo, young, clever, too fast sometimes, who I am teaching to slow down. There are the 2 physiotherapists, the Soares sisters, who are not actually sisters but arrived together and the name stuck. And there is me. And then there are the patients, who are the point of all of it. You would think the hardest part of this work is the building of the limb. It isn't. The hardest part is the waiting room, because in the waiting room people are deciding whether to hope. Some of them have lost a leg years ago and have lived bent and dependent for so long that the idea of walking again feels almost like a cruelty, a door they are afraid to open in case it's painted on the wall. You have to coax the hope out of them slowly, the way you coax a frightened animal, because if you promise too much too fast and the fitting goes badly, you don't just fail. You confirm what they already feared, which is that they were foolish to want anything. 2 of them matter to this story. The first is Domingos. He is 14, maybe 15. Nobody, including Domingos, is entirely sure, and he lost his right leg below the knee to a mine while herding goats 2 years ago. He should, by every rule of the human heart, be a sad boy. He is the opposite. He is the loudest, most relentlessly confident person I have ever fitted. From the day we gave him his first leg, before he could even walk on it properly, he announced to the entire waiting room that he was going to be a footballer, a great one, the greatest, and that anyone who doubted him could settle the matter on the pitch. He challenges everyone. He challenged Faustino, who is 70. He challenged me. He challenged a visiting auditor from the funding body, a man in a suit who had clearly never kicked anything in his life. "One match," Domingo says, holding up one finger, deadly serious. "You and me, you will lose." It became the clinic's joke, our small weather. Any tense morning, any difficult fitting, somebody would mutter, "Careful, Domingos will challenge you," and the room would loosen. The second is Armando. Armando is somewhere past 60. He lost his left leg above the knee a very long time ago, in the war itself, not the aftermath, and he has lived without it for most of his adult life, getting around on a crutch worn smooth as bone by his hand. He had been coming to the clinic every week for 2 months. He had been measured, casted, fitted with a trial socket, and in all that time, across all those weeks, I'm not sure I had heard him say 40 words. He answered questions with a nod or a shake. He did the exercises the Soar sisters set him exactly, without complaint and without comment. He sat in the same chair, the one at the end of the row nearest the door, and he watched everything with a still, dark attention like a man at the back of a church. We knew almost nothing about him. He had not given us a story to know. I had decided he was simply a private man, and I had left him his privacy, and I had thought no more about it. That, it turned out, was a mistake, though not the kind I expected. That was the room. That was the work. And outside the walls, always in the fields beyond the cleared lanes, in the soft red ground past the markers, the patient enemy was still waiting. You learn to live with it. You learn the cleared paths the way I once should have been taught to fear the short one. But it never fully leaves your mind because the waiting room keeps reminding you. The ground is still full. We are just emptying it one person at a time, the slow way, the human way, after it has already done what it does. The news about the visitor came down through Teresa, which is how all news comes, complete and slightly editorialized. There would be a guest. From the charity, the one whose funding kept our lights on and our plaster stocked, the international organization that worked on the clearing of the fields and the rebuilding of the people the fields had broken. The guest was important. There would be preparations. We were to carry on exactly as normal and also to make everything perfect, which is the kind of instruction that only makes sense to people who plan visits for a living. I will be honest about my reaction because I think it matters. I was annoyed. I had seen visits before. I had seen the suits and the cameras and the careful smiles, the way a working clinic gets turned into a stage set for an afternoon, the way the patients get arranged like furniture and thanked for their courage by someone who will forget their faces before the car door closes. I had a full schedule that day. I had Armando's next fitting, which I cared about more than I could explain. I had a boy with a growing residual limb who needed his socket adjusted before it started causing him pain. I did not have an afternoon to give to a photograph. "It's a working visit," Teresa said, reading my face the way she reads everyone's. They were very clear about that, not a ceremony. "They're always very clear about that," I said. She gave me a look that meant we would not be discussing it further, and went back to her desk. So we prepared, quietly, the way you prepare for whether you can't stop. We did not change the schedule. That was the one thing I insisted on, and Teresa backed me, and the charity coordinator who arrived 2 days early to walk through the building agreed without argument, which surprised me. The patients who were booked stayed booked. Armando's fitting stayed where it was in the afternoon. We would simply be doing our ordinary work while someone watched. I told myself I could survive being watched. Then the coordinator told us who was coming. It was the prince, Harry. He was traveling with the charity, the coordinator explained, the one connected to the clearing of the minefields, and his connection to this particular cause was not new and not casual. His mother had walked through a cleared minefield in this country, in Wombo itself, almost 30 years ago, in front of the world's cameras, to make people look at something they would rather not look at. The image had gone everywhere. It had changed things. And here was her son, decades later, still pulling the world's attention back to the same ground, the same buried problem, the same slow human work of clearing and rebuilding. The room went very quiet when the coordinator said the name. Even Teresa was quiet, which is rare. Then Domingos, who had been listening from his chair with his new leg stretched out in front of him, sat up straight and said with total conviction, "I will challenge him, the prince, to football. He will lose." Bernardo laughed. The Soares sisters laughed. The coordinator looked alarmed and then, watching Domingos's face, decided the boy was serious, which he absolutely was. I laughed too. And then, because I am the kind of person who notices the quiet ones, I looked across the room at Armando. He had not laughed. He had not moved. He was sitting in his usual chair by the door, his smooth-handled crutch leaning against his knee, and he was looking at the floor in front of him with an expression I could not read at all. Not fear, not excitement. Something more like a man hearing a sound from very far away, a sound he recognized and had not expected to hear again. He said nothing. He said nothing for the rest of the afternoon. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed, and I filed it away without understanding it, the way you file away a symptom before you know what it means. The evening before the visit, I stayed late to finish Armando's trial-fitting checks, and the generator died at 6, exactly as the worst part of me had predicted, plunging the workshop into the thick orange light of the emergency lamps. Faustino swore at it gently, the way he always does, like a man scolding an old dog he loves. I worked by lamplight on the alignment of Armando's socket, the careful business of making sure that, when he finally put his weight on it, the limb would carry him true and not betray him. It is precise work. A few degrees wrong and a man limps, or worse, the stump takes the load badly and breaks down, and then you have given him pain instead of freedom. I checked it 3 times. I'm not ashamed to say I cared more about that socket than about any visit. When I finished, I walked home. The road out of the clinic runs past a stretch of ground that was cleared 2 years ago. There are markers along it, the small painted stakes that say the lane is safe, and beyond them the open red field that is not. I have walked that road 1,000 times. That evening I walked it slowly. The light was going down behind the hills the color of an old bruise, and the dust hung in the air, and I thought about Bruno, as I always do on that stretch, and about the short path and the long one. I thought about what it actually means to give a person back the ability to walk a road. Not a metaphor. The literal thing. To stand up, to bear your own weight, to go where you need to go on your own 2 legs without asking anyone to carry you or wait for you or pity you. And I made a decision, walking home in the dust. I decided I would not perform tomorrow. I would not put on the careful smile and arrange my patients like furniture. I would do the work, the real work, in front of whoever wanted to watch, and if the watching meant nothing, then at least the work would still be done. That was the most I was willing to give the day. As it turned out, the day asked for less performance than I'd feared and gave back more than I'd allowed myself to hope. The morning arrived washed clean. It had rained in the night, hard and brief, the way it does, and the rain had settled the dust and pressed the red road flat and dark, and the whole town looked for an hour or 2 like a photograph of a better place. The air was almost cool. The tin roof had not yet begun to bake. I remember standing in the clinic doorway with a cup of bad coffee, watching the light come up over the hills, thinking that whatever else happened, at least it was a beautiful morning, and that beauty here is never free and never lasts, which is maybe why we notice it. The security came first, quiet and professional, walking the building, checking the lanes, talking in low voices. Then the small convoy on the road, the dust rising and falling behind it. The patients were already arriving for their appointments. Exactly as scheduled, because we had refused to clear the day, and so the waiting room filled up the way it always did. with people who had come to get their legs and their arms and their lives back and who happened today to have company. Domingos was practicing. He had a small worn ball and he was knocking it from foot to new foot in the yard with enormous concentration like an athlete before a final. The Soares sisters were trying to get him to sit down. He would not sit down. He had a match to win. Armando was in his chair by the door, still, watching, his crutch against his knee. I had braced myself for grandeur, for the room to change, for everything to become a stage. That is not what happened, and I want to be careful describing it, because it would be easy to make it into something it wasn't. He came in without much around him, fewer people than I expected. He was taller than the photographs make him seem, or maybe everyone is, and dressed plainly. And the first thing I noticed, the thing that disarmed the resentment I had been nursing for 3 days, was that he did not look at the room the way visitors look at a room like this. There is a way important people look at a clinic full of the wounded. A soft, practiced, charitable expression that says, how moving, how brave, and slides off everything without landing. He didn't do that. He looked at the place like a man who had been in places like it before and knew what he was looking at. He looked at the patients like they were people he had come to listen to, not a backdrop he had come to be photographed against. He moved slowly. That was the second thing. He was in no hurry at all. He went down the line of plastic chairs and he stopped at each person and he crouched. He got down to their level eye to eye every time so that no one had to look up at him, and he spoke quietly. And then, this is the part I keep returning to, he stopped speaking and he listened. For a long time, far longer than he spoke. He asked a few small questions and then he let the silences sit, and he did not fill them. And people who had not meant to say much found themselves saying more, because that is what happens when someone genuinely waits for you. He came to where I was standing by the casting station and the coordinator introduced me. He asked about the fittings, not for the cameras, about the actual fittings, how we made the sockets, where the materials came from, whether we could produce the components locally or whether we were dependent on shipments from outside. Real questions. The kind you only ask if you have learned that the work fails when the supply chain fails, when the first delivery arrives and works, and then the replacement parts require a 6-month wait and the whole thing quietly collapses. I answered him honestly. I told him what we could make here and what we still couldn't, what we were short of, where the bottleneck was. He listened to that the same way he listened to the patients, which I respected more than I expected to. And then Domingos struck. The boy had been waiting, ball under his arm with the patience of a hunter, and the moment there was a gap he stepped forward and planted himself directly in the visitor's path and held up one finger and delivered his challenge, the one we had all heard 100 times, in the careful English he had clearly been practicing for 2 days. One match, you and me. You will lose. The whole room held its breath. The coordinator made a small, strangled sound. I think a security person took half a step. And the visitor laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him, and he looked at the ball under the boy's arm and then at the boy's new leg, the prosthetic Domingos was so proud of, planted there in the dust as solid as the real one. And he said something I didn't fully catch, but that made Domingos' whole face open up like a window. And then the two of them went out into the wet flat yard and Domingos got his match. Not a real one. A few minutes of knocking a ball back and forth in the mud while everyone pretended not to watch and watched. Domingos, of course, declared victory. He has declared victory ever since. He tells the story now to every new patient, embellishing freely. The leg, in his telling, scored 4 goals. The clinic has never let him forget it and never will, and that is exactly as it should be. It would have been an easy place to end the visit. A boy, a ball, a laugh, a photograph that needed no arranging because it was true. That is the story everyone expected, the one that writes itself, and I think most people in that yard assumed it was the story they had come to see. It wasn't. The real one was sitting in the chair by the door and had not moved. I almost missed it. I was watching Domingos like everyone else. but I am the one who notices the quiet ones, and out of the corner of my eye I saw the visitor come back in from the yard, still smiling from the football, and I saw his eye travel down the line of chairs the way it had before, stopping at each person, and I saw it reach the end of the row, the chair by the door, the silent man with the smooth crutch and the still dark attention. And I saw the visitor stop. He didn't move on. He didn't do the warm, brief, charitable thing and slide past. Something in how Armando was sitting or how he was looking made the visitor cross the room and crouch down in front of him, the way he had with the others, eye to eye, and say something quiet, and then wait. I drifted closer. I tell myself it was because Armando was my patient and his fitting was that afternoon and I had a professional reason to be near. The truth is I simply could not stay away. 2 months of 40 words. I wanted to see what the silence would do. For a long moment it did nothing. Armando looked at the man crouched in front of him and the man looked back and did not fill the silence, did not move on, did not glance at his watch or his people, just stayed there at eye level and waited and let the quiet be quiet. And then Armando began to talk. He talked the way water comes out of dry ground when you finally dig deep enough, slow at first, then all at once. He told the man, in the soft, careful Portuguese of an old man who has not had much practice at being listened to, where he had lost the leg, and when, and how long ago, which was longer ago than I had realized, longer ago than the boy outside had been alive. He told him about the years on the crutch. He told him about the things he had stopped being able to do, not the big things, the small ones, the ones nobody asks about. That he had not been able to carry his own grandchild because he needed both hands for the crutch and the ground. That he had not stood at his daughter's wedding, had sat instead at the side, because standing for that long on the crutch was beyond him, and he had not wanted to be the old man swaying. That he had spent 30 years being helped, and that being helped every day for 30 years by people who loved him, was a kind of slow erosion he had never found the words to describe to anyone, because who would he describe it to? The helping was kindness. He could not resent the kindness. But it had worn him down to almost nothing, the way his hand had worn the crutch smooth, and he had stopped expecting to feel like a whole man again, and so he had stopped talking about it, because there was no point talking about a door painted on a wall. That was why he had been silent, not privacy. He had simply stopped believing there was anyone to tell. He had come to the clinic every week, done his exercises, worn his trial socket, and not let himself hope, because hope had a cost he had paid before and could not afford to pay again. He said all of this to a stranger crouched in the dust, because the stranger had done the one thing almost nobody does. He had waited. He had not performed listening. He had listened. I will not pretend to tell you what the visitor said back. It was quiet, and it was brief, and most of it was not for me to hear, and I would not put words in his mouth that I did not catch clearly. I can tell you only what I saw, which was a man who said very little and stayed a very long time, and who at the end of it put his hand briefly on the old man's shoulder, the way you would with someone you had decided to take seriously, and then stood, and let Armando keep his composure, which I understood to be its own kind of respect. He did not turn the old man's 30 years into a moment for anyone else. He let it stay Armando's. Then the visit moved on the way visits do. There were a few more chairs in the row. There was, eventually, the convoy and the dust and the road. By the middle of the afternoon, the clinic was just the clinic again, the tin roof baking, the generator threatening, the plastic chairs empty, Domingo's long gone home to tell his version to anyone who would stand still. It was, in almost every measurable way, an ordinary day. A man had come and listened and left. Nothing in the building had changed. The fields outside were still full. We would still be emptying them one person at a time, the slow way for years. Except that Armando's fitting was that afternoon. And I had decided, walking home in the dust the night before, that I would do the real work in front of whoever was watching. And now no one was watching at all, which was, I think, the point I had been too proud to admit I wanted. So I finished it. In the empty workshop, with Faustino's careful hands and Bernardo learning to slow down beside me, I fitted Armando with the leg we had spent 2 months building for him. I checked the alignment I had checked 3 times by lamplight. I watched his face as he took the first weight on it, the moment that tells you everything. The moment of fitting is either a gift or a cruelty. I held my breath the way you always do. It held, the alignment was true, he stood on it. And then in the quiet of the empty clinic, with the afternoon light coming flat and gold through the windows and the dust hanging in it, Armando let go of the parallel bars and took a step. Then another. He crossed the room on his own 2 legs, the smooth-handled crutch left leaning against the chair by the door where it belonged now, and he reached the doorway, and he stopped, and he stood there in the light under his own weight, an old man standing as long as he wanted to stand, and he did not say anything. He did not need to. I had heard him say everything he had to say to a stranger an hour before. The walking was the rest of it. I watched him go down the steps and out onto the flat red road slowly, carefully, learning the new gait, refusing the arm Bernardo offered, and I thought about Bruno, and the footpath, and the short road and the long one, and what it costs to carry water, and what it gives back to walk where you choose on your own legs. I had come home on purpose to this dust, to this heat, to this tin oven of a building, because the buried thing took something from people, and I am stubborn enough to want to give a little of it back. Most days I tell myself the giving back is the leg, the mechanism, the socket and the alignment and the careful work of 3 checks by lamplight. But it isn't only that, and the silent man taught me so. On an ordinary Thursday I had decided in advance to hate. The leg let him walk. The listening let him be a whole man again, just for an hour in front of one person who waited. He had carried 30 years that no one had asked to hear, and being heard had not undone a single day of it, the way a new leg does not undo the mine. But it was repair anyway. The slow, human, unglamorous kind. The kind that doesn't make the photograph, and doesn't change the world, and doesn't empty a single field, and matters more than all of it. Most days I show up and work and send people home a little more whole than they came, and then I do it again. That is the job. I had stopped expecting the days to surprise me. I don't anymore. I had it backward, all that resentment, all that bracing for a stranger to perform. The grand thing was never going to be the visit. The grand thing was a man by the door who finally believed there was someone to tell, and an empty clinic in the gold light, and the sound of careful footsteps going down onto a road that, this time, somebody had made safe to walk. That was my Thursday. That is what actually happened instead. There is a kind of morning that stops surprising you. You learn the sound of the generator the way you learn a person's cough, and you know from the first stutter whether it will hold through the afternoon or die at the worst possible moment, which is always during a fitting. You learn the smell of wet plaster and the particular silence of a waiting room full of people who have already waited years. You stop expecting the day to be anything other than the day.